There is a detail I have left out every time I have told this story. Not because it is the part that frightens people. It isn't. The fire at Site 40 frightens people. The radio call at 2247 frightens people. The handwriting change in a 30-year-old logbook frightens people. Those are the parts that get the reaction, the held breath, the quiet on the other end of the phone when I tell a version of this to someone I trust. Those are the parts that earn the silence. The detail I leave out does not earn silence. It earns something worse, a particular kind of stillness in a person that I can only describe as the stillness of someone who has just understood the shape of a problem they were hoping was smaller. I have watched it happen in the two people I have told the complete version to. I have watched them sit with it. I have watched them decide, one at a time, that they would rather think about something else. I understand that impulse completely. I have had it myself, about my own story, for 3 years. I am including the detail this time. I have decided. Not because I have found a way to make it easier to hear I haven't, but because without it, everything else I tell you is the shape of a truth without the truth inside it. You will understand what happened in the Caldwell Fork drainage. You will understand the rules and the logbooks and the fire and the radio and the frost morning footprints. You will follow the whole sequence and arrive at what feels like an ending. And it will be almost correct. Almost is not good enough. Not for this. Not anymore. So I am going back to October, to the drive-in, to the version of myself that existed before I understood what the Cataloochee Valley does to the kind of person I was. I need you to understand that person first, so that what happened to her makes the particular kind of sense it needs to make. I am, professionally, a solver. That is the cleanest way I know to say it. 8 years in field medicine before the SAR recruitment. Before that, EMT certification at 23 in a rural county where the nearest trauma center was 40 minutes out. And the gap between what you could do and what you needed to do was something you filled with training and repetition, and a specific quality of forward momentum that people in my field either have naturally or never fully develop. I had it naturally. My supervisors noted it early. My colleagues relied on it. I did not think of it as a personality trait. I thought of it as the job. Wilderness First Responder certification at 26. The SAR recruitment came 3 years after that, from a regional coordinator who had seen my incident reports and apparently found them unusual in a way he considered useful. He called it precision. I called it the only way I knew how to write. You described what you found, in the sequence you found it, without interpretation layered over the observation. The observation was the job. Interpretation came after, when you had enough observations to justify it. I was good at finding people who had been lost by terrain and weather, and their own poor decisions. I was good at it in the specific way that means you can feel the shape of a search before the grid is fully drawn. Not instinct, exactly, but pattern recognition accumulated over enough callouts that it stops feeling like calculation and starts feeling like understanding. I knew how terrain funneled people. I knew how exhaustion made decisions. I knew how a missing hiker thought, and moved, and stopped moving. And where? I was wrong once. I will not make it dramatic, because it is not dramatic in my memory. It is just present, the way a calculation error is present, not a wound exactly, but a permanent annotation in the margin of every search pattern I have run since. A man named Curtis Lee, overdue from a solo section hike in a storm weather window. I read the terrain and the weather and his stated itinerary, and I believed, clearly and with data behind it, that he had sheltered in the drainage west of his intended route. The team's search lead took us east. I flagged my disagreement. I was overruled correctly, because I was not search lead, and the disagreement was not dispositive. We searched east. We found him west. By the time we found him west, it was 3 days later, and it was recovery, not rescue. I have never formally blamed myself. I have never formally blamed anyone. I have simply rerouted every search pattern in my head, every call-out since, with the quiet, mechanical diligence of a person making a correction to a document that will never be submitted. The Caldwell Fork assignment was a season-long post-October through the 1st of December. Isolated rating. Significant bonus. The solitude was the kind I thought I could use, the kind you could work in, the kind that felt like penance you could quantify and complete. I was wrong about what kind of solitude it was. The road into Cataloochee is unpaved from the gap. You turn off the state highway before first light if you are starting at the time the assignment brief recommends, and the gravel starts almost immediately a narrow 2-track that climbs through second-growth hardwood before cresting the ridge and dropping into the valley in a long, winding descent that feels more like entering something than arriving somewhere. The trees close over the road in sections. The sky appears and disappears through gaps in the canopy. By the time you are fully below the ridgeline, the valley is around you on 3 sides, and the road is the only geometry that is straight. I came in on the 4th of October. The elk were in the lower meadow before I reached the valley floor. 3 cows and a bull at the tree line's edge, standing in the gray pre-dawn light with the particular stillness of animals that have not yet decided whether to be alarmed. The bull was facing away from me. I could see the mass of him, the antler spread, the slow, deliberate shift of his weight as the truck passed. He did not run. He turned his head and watched. I noted this as normal elk behavior and continued down the road. The Palmer Chapel was on my left, white clappered in the mist, its small graveyard behind a rusted iron fence. Beyond it, through the roadside growth, the foundation stones of the old homesteads were just visible gray rectangles of stacked rock holding nothing up, outlined in the wet leaves of early October, persisting without purpose in the way of things built to last by people who expected to remain. Cataloochee was a full mountain community once, 1,200 people, farms, churches, a school. The Park Service displaced every one of them in the late 1930s, bought the land for fair market prices that were not fair by any measurement that included the concept of home. The buildings were left standing for a while, then removed. The foundations stayed. The graveyards stayed, because you cannot relocate a graveyard without permission of the dead. The old Cataloochee schoolhouse was still standing on my right, preserved a small, careful building with its windows intact, and a historical marker beside it that I could not read at speed. The rhododendron along the creek bank was so dense it formed a secondary canopy at shoulder height, tunneling the road in sections where the growth had closed in. The fog was beginning to come in from the Tennessee drainage to the west, not moving exactly, but thickening in the low places between the trees, settling into the meadow margins with the patient, deliberate quality of something that had been doing this for a very long time. I drove slowly. The valley was beautiful in the way of places that once belonged to people. The specific beauty of accumulated absence, a landscape that remembers having been witnessed. I was thinking about the assignment brief and the radio protocol and the campsite welfare schedule. I was not thinking about the quality of the silence, though I registered it. I registered it the way you register a muted sound on a job site, not as important, not yet, but as a detail your brain files without instruction. The valley was very quiet for a place full of elk. The Caldwell Fork Backcountry Ranger Station is a single-room structure set back from the trail junction in a flat clearing backed by a hemlock stand. Board and batten siding, painted the particular green that GSMNP uses for its backcountry infrastructure, a color that suggests official purpose without demanding attention. Metal roof. A wood stove flew through the south pitch. A generator shed on the east side, padlocked. The lights were on inside. I registered this before I registered anything else, because it was wrong. The previous ranger, a man named Daniel Tull, season assignment, now departed, had been out of the valley for 4 days. The station should have been dark. The fact that it was not dark meant either that Tull had left the lights on when he left, which was a power and safety violation, or that someone had turned them on more recently. Neither explanation was immediately alarming, but both required accounting for. Tull's truck was gone. The door was unlocked. The interior was clean and organized in the particular way of someone who is good at the physical habits of the job, and less careful about the administrative ones. The supply log on the wall was current. The first aid kit was properly restocked. The topo maps were pinned with the correct seasonal overlays. The wood stove had a fresh grate. The radio shelf was dust-free. The cot had been stripped and the bedding left folded on the footlocker. On the table, centered, was the SAR protocol binder, open to Section 3. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Not from alarm, from the specific, mild irritation of a professional who has arrived at a handover that was not completed correctly. The binder being open was either carelessness or a message, and I preferred carelessness as an explanation. I preferred it strongly. I noted in the mental ledger I keep of things to follow up on that Tull had not filed a final week of daily logs. The assignment history showed his last submitted entry was October 1st. He had been in the valley through October 3rd, per his checkout timestamp. 3 days of missing entries, not a firing offense, a documentation failure, persistent and irritating, of the kind that falls to the next occupant to note in their opening report. I set my pack on the footlocker. I looked at the binder for a moment, at the page it was open to, and then I closed it. Morning, I decided. The binder would wait until morning. There was a sequencing to how I handled new assignments, and it began with the physical layout of the space, the equipment inventory, the radio test, and coffee. The binder was fourth or fifth on that list. Whatever Section 3 contained had waded through Tull's entire season. It could wait through 1 cup of coffee. I was practical. I dealt with things in order. I made the coffee and stood at the window and watched the fog thicken in the meadow margin, and told myself that the lights being on had a simple explanation I hadn't found yet. I still believe it had a simple explanation. I have just never found it. I opened the binder the next morning at 06:15, before the first patrol, with coffee and the particular quality of morning attention that is not yet defensive. A standard SAR protocol binder for a GSMNP backcountry station has a recognizable architecture. Incident command hierarchy first, the chain of reporting from solo backcountry ranger up through zone coordinator, district supervisor, park operations center, with radio call signs and backup contact numbers at each level. This section is tabbed and laminated because it is the section you need to find quickly in a situation where finding things quickly is the difference between a successful evacuation and a body recovery. Behind that, search pattern protocols, hasty search parameters, the first rapid sweep of the most likely areas, high probability terrain, the route the missing subject was most likely to have followed based on their stated itinerary and the terrain's natural funneling. Behind hasty, grid search systematic coverage of defined sectors, segment by segment, the slower and more exhaustive operation you initiate when the hasty comes back empty. Probability of area calculations, confinement strategies, the theory of lost person behavior organized by subject type. Day hiker, overnight solo, elderly, child. Each profile with its own statistical movement patterns. Behind search patterns, medical escalation thresholds, hypothermia staging, traumatic injury field assessment, the specific physiological markers that distinguish a hiker who needs help from a hiker who needs immediate evacuation, and a hiker for whom evacuation is no longer the primary objective. This section I knew cold from 8 years of field medicine. I read it anyway. Reading familiar material in a new assignment is not redundancy. It is calibration. Behind medical, campsite grid references. Caldwell Fork drainage backcountry campsites numbered 37 through 41, with GPS coordinates, water source locations, fire ring positions, capacity ratings, and the access trail times from the station. Site 37 was the closest 40 minutes at patrol pace, 25 at urgency pace. Site 41 was the farthest, 2 hours on a clear day on the upper drainage trail. Behind campsites, radio protocols, channel assignments, check-in schedule, dead zone map. A printed topographic overlay with the signal black areas shaded in gray, which covered, I noted, the entire valley floor below 2,800 feet elevation. Ridge communication only. The notation at the bottom of the dead zone map read, "In the absence of radio contact, maintain scheduled check-ins from designated ridge access points. Do not assume communication failure indicates emergency." Communication failure in this drainage is the baseline condition. Every element of this binder was familiar. Every element was professionally legible and correctly formatted and built from the same federal SAR framework I had used for years. It was a competent document. It was a document built by people who understood the job. That is exactly what made Section 3 so hard to process. I had spent 45 minutes reading a document that thought the way I thought, organized the way I organized, anticipated the concerns I would have in the sequence I would have them. And then I reached the laminated cover sheet for Section 3. The cover sheet read, Caldwell Fork, SAR, Protocol, Addendum, Section 3, Seasonal. This section is subject to annual administrative review. The current version supersedes all previous versions. Do not retain previous versions on site. Below that, in smaller text, failure to comply with any provision of this section during the period, October 1st to December 1st, should be reported to the district office. Non-compliant incidents will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. The formatting was identical to every other section of the binder. Government font. Consistent header style. The lamination was the same weight and finish. There was nothing visually anomalous about the document. It looked like what it was supposed to look like. I turned the page. Rule number 1. When conducting a hasty search in the Caldwell Fork drainage after 1,800 hours, do not call out the missing person's name more than 3 times in any 10-minute interval. I read this and set down my coffee cup. Not from alarm, from professional friction. Every SAR protocol I had trained under, every field operation manual, every instructor who had ever evaluated my performance in a night hasty drill had told me the same thing. Call the name. Call it loudly. Call it often. The voice is your primary tool in a dark search environment. Restricting call frequency in a drainage with heavy tree cover was not a safety provision. It was a liability. I made a note in the margin of my field notepad, Wildlife Harassment Ordinance, check, and moved on. Rule number 2. If a campsite in sites 37 through 41 appears unoccupied, but a fire is burning, do not approach within 30 meters. Log the observation. Do not log the grid coordinates. Return to station. This one I read twice. The instruction to log an observation while deliberately omitting its location was not a safety provision. It was the opposite of documentation. A fire at an unoccupied site was a potential emergency indicator. It meant either an unregistered occupant, which was a permit violation requiring follow-up, or an abandoned fire, which was a wildfire risk requiring immediate assessment. The 30-meter exclusion zone had no plausible professional rationale I could construct. I wrote in my notepad, Documentation Procedure Inversion. Clarify with District Office. Rule number 3. If a woman's voice asks you to confirm your name and position on the radio between 2200 and 0200, do not confirm. Do not deny. Respond only with your permit number. If the voice uses your first name, end the transmission immediately and do not initiate radio contact again until dawn. I went still. Not because it was frightening, not yet, but because it was specific in a way that required explanation. Radio misuse protocols existed. Impersonation protocols existed. Every one of them I had encountered was written in gender-neutral procedural language. This rule specified a woman's voice. The current occupant of this station was a woman. The rule was written before I arrived. I read it a third time, then set the page down and read, Rule number 4. Rule number 4. During the elk rut, if you hear a bull elk calling from the direction of the Beech Grove Cemetery, do not count the calls. If you have already begun counting, stop at 6 and do not resume. I almost laughed. It was the almost that stopped me. The rule was technically incoherent. You cannot instruct a person not to count a repeating auditory stimulus, because counting is not a decision. It is a reflex that precedes decision. The instruction presupposed a level of deliberate cognitive control that does not exist in the way it was being described. And yet, it was in the binder, in official formatting, under a professional header. Someone had decided this was worth writing down. Someone had decided it mattered enough to laminate. Rule number 5. The logbook must be signed out each evening before 2,000 hours with an entry. If you cannot think of anything to write, write the temperature. Do not leave the logbook unsigned for any evening of your assignment. If you miss an evening, do not backfill the entry. Leave the gap. The gap instruction. I underlined it twice. In 8 years of professional documentation, across every operation, every station, every assignment I had held, the standing instruction had always been the same. Accurate records, complete records, no gaps. A gap in an official log was a gap in the chain of custody of the incident record. It was a vulnerability in the institutional memory, the explicit instruction not to correct a gap, not to backfill a missed entry that was not a safety provision. That was a permanent self-incrimination. A notation in the record that something had happened, and the ranger either could not or would not document it. I read rule number 6, and I stopped writing in my notepad. Rule number 6. On the morning of the first frost, walk the perimeter of the station before entering. If you find footprints that are not yours, do not measure them, do not photograph them, and do not follow them. Cover them with loose leaves or soil, and return inside. I sat with this for a long time. Every instinct I had, 8 years of field medicine, 3 years of search and rescue. Every hour of incident documentation training told me that rule number 6 described the systematic destruction of physical evidence. The instruction not to photograph was especially precise in its wrongness. Photographic documentation of physical evidence at a scene was not optional in any professional framework I had ever worked within. It was the baseline. It was the beginning. Someone had written that rule, knowing exactly what they were asking a professional to suppress. I looked at rule number 3 again. The scenario, it described a woman's voice on the radio. A first name required the rule writer to have known, before I arrived, that this year's ranger would be a woman. That this year's ranger would have a first name worth using. I went to make more coffee. I did not particularly want coffee. I needed something to do with my hands. The binder had a sleeve pocket on the inside back cover, the standard transparent document sleeve common to all government field binders, normally used for supplemental maps or permit forms. I had not looked at it on first review because it was behind the last tabbed section, and I had been reading front to back in sequence. It was visibly bulging. I stood at the table and spread the contents out. 5 laminated cards, each approximately half the size of a standard sheet, each with a date in the upper right corner, each in the same handwriting, compact, slightly left-leaning, printed rather than cursive, the particular hand of someone trained to write legibly under field conditions. The oldest was dated October 2015. The most recent before this year was October 2023. I arranged them in order. The 2015 version of Rule Number 3. If you hear a child crying near Site 39, do not follow the sound past the creek crossing. If you have already crossed, stop moving and do not call out. Wait until the crying stops, then return to the station by the upper trail only. The 2017 version. If your radio begins transmitting on its own between 0100 and 0300, do not attempt to diagnose the malfunction. Remove the battery. Do not replace it until first light. Do not investigate the source of any transmissions you may hear during this period. The 2019 version. If you find a campfire burning at an unoccupied site, do not approach. Do not call out. Do not log the coordinates. Return to station immediately, and do not conduct evening welfare checks for the following 3 nights. The 2022 version. If a figure is visible at the meadow margin between the Palmer Homestead Foundation and the creek, do not use your flashlight. Do not move toward it. If it begins moving toward the station, go inside, lock the door, and do not open it until you can verify daylight through the window. The 2023 version. If the radio produces a transmission in a voice you recognize, do not respond. Even if the voice is a colleague, even if the voice says there is an emergency. Especially then. I read all 5 in sequence. Then I reread this year's version. If a woman's voice asks you to confirm your name and position on the radio between 2200 and 0200, do not confirm. Do not deny. Respond only with your permit number. If the voice uses your first name, end the transmission immediately and do not initiate radio contact again until dawn. The progression was visible. Each version was more specific than the last. Each one narrowed the gap between general safety instruction and precise situational description, as if each year the author knew more about what to expect, as if each year the information was better. I turned each card over, looking for a signature, an origin marker, a name. The backs were blank. The lamination was professional, Park service weight, the same as the current version. There was no identification. There was only the handwriting consistent across all 5 cards. All 8 years. The same hand. I spread all 6 versions in a row, the 5 from the sleeve and this year's from the binder itself, and looked at them together. The scenario descriptions shifted. The specificity increased. The handwriting did not change. And then I noticed what I had missed on the first read. The first 5 versions, every previous Rule Number 3, were written in past tense. If you hear, if you find. The language of instruction, yes, but instruction from experience. The language of someone who had been through something and was describing the shape of it. This year's version was written in future tense. If a woman's voice asks, not if you hear a voice, not if a voice asks, a woman's voice, my voice's category, the category of the person who had not yet arrived when this card was written. I looked at the date in the upper right corner. September 1st. I looked at the date on the assignment confirmation email I had saved locally on my phone, the one that had come through when I had signal 4 weeks ago, before I drove into the valley. I already knew, before I opened the email, what I was going to find. The first week was functional. I want to be precise about that, because the story I am telling has the shape of something that was wrong from the beginning, and that is not accurate. The first week was a normal SAR week in a genuinely beautiful, genuinely functional field assignment. I did the job. The job was real, and it was mine, and I was good at it. And for 7 days, the valley gave me nothing to be afraid of that I could name. Morning log entries at 0600, weather, temperature, visibility, overnight notes. The wood stove burned efficiently. The hemlock stand behind the station cut the wind from the north to almost nothing, and the station held warmth well into mid-morning. Coffee, the morning protocol review, the first radio check from the ridge at 0715. A sharp hike up through switchback oak growth to the point where the valley's radio dead zone lifted and signal arrived in clean, reliable bursts. Check-in confirmed. Welfare status nominal. No overnight incidents in the wider park sector. Mid-morning campsite welfare checks. The loop from Station South to Site 37. East along the creek drainage to 38 and 39. And then the longer push north to 40 and 41 on alternating days. The campsites in the Caldwell Fork drainage were occupied irregularly at the start of October, a pair of experienced overnight hikers at 37 for 2 nights, a solo through hiker at 38 who was experienced, well-equipped, and entirely self-sufficient. The permit system gave me names and itineraries. I checked in with each registered camper, noted any equipment concerns, confirmed planned departure dates, standard welfare, normal work. The elk were everywhere. This is not an exaggeration, and it is not atmospheric decoration. The Cataloochee elk herd in early October rut was a physical presence in the valley, in the way that weather is a physical presence. The bulls moved through the meadow margins at dusk, their rut calls beginning in the late afternoon and continuing well past dark. A sound the wildlife reference binder described as a high-pitched, bugling vocalization, beginning with a series of high notes and descending into a deep, resonant bellow. The description was accurate as far as it went. What it did not capture was the quality of the sound in the fog, heavy air of the lower valley, the way the terrain reflected and distorted the calls, the way they arrived from directions that didn't always correlate with the direction of the animal when you finally located it by headlamp. The first night I heard them clearly, I stood outside the station for a few minutes and listened. A bull somewhere beyond the meadow, bugling in long intervals, the bellow portion rolling in off the creek drainage and arriving at the station with a slight delay from the initial call. The echo, distinguishable from the source only if you knew the terrain geometry. I knew the terrain geometry. I noted in my log that the elk rut had begun in full, and that the acoustic environment at night would be complex. I noted this without alarm. This is important. I noted it as a practical operational fact, the way you note all practical operational facts in a field log without interpretation, without emphasis, without any suggestion that the sound of a bull elk in rut might be something other than the sound of a bull elk in rut. On the third night, a solo hiker at Site 41 was overdue from a planned day walk to the upper ridge. The permit showed a planned return of 1,700 hours. By 1830, there was no sign. I initiated a hasty search. The hasty search route for Site 41 from the station runs north on the main Caldwell Fork Trail, then northeast up the spur trail toward the upper drainage. I know this route now. That first night, I was reading it off the topo as I moved. Headlamp on the map, headlamp on the trail. The rhythm of the scan that comes from practice. The hiker's name was James Aldrich. Solo, experienced, adequate equipment, planned single-day ridge walk. James. First call at approximately 1840, 20 meters into the spur trail. Standard volume, standard interval. Silence. Then the creek. The creek sounds like static in a drainage, this tight, white noise underlayer that swallows the mid-range tones and makes the forest silence feel acoustically occupied, even when it isn't. James. Second call 2 minutes later. Slightly elevated elevation, slightly louder. The trees opened a little at the switchback. My voice carried better here. I waited. Wind. Creek. An elk somewhere very far to the west. A single low note. And then nothing. James. Third call, 2 more minutes. At the bench level where the spur trail flattened. I was counting intervals. 3 calls in 6 minutes, well within rule number 1's restriction of 3 per 10-minute interval. I was aware of rule number 1. I had reread it that morning. I was aware it was professionally irrational, and I had a note to query it with the district office on my next ridge communication. I was aware of all of this. 4 minutes passed. I should have made the 4th call. The professional rhythm of a night hasty search built a call every 2 minutes on average in low visibility drainage terrain. It was not a rule I had to consciously follow. It was muscle memory built over 3 years of SAR work. 4 calls in 8 minutes was correct. 4 calls in 8 minutes was the job. I called his name a 4th time. The forest on the left side of the trail uphill, northwest face. Dense second growth with a rhododendron thicket at the lower edge moved. Not the wind. The wind was from the south and steady, and I had been reading it for 6 minutes. This movement was in the upper canopy of the hardwoods, a progressive disturbance in the branch structure. The kind of movement made by weight transferring through a connected system. Something was moving through the upper forest in a direction that corresponded, approximately, to a bearing on my voice. Not running. The movement was deliberate, patient. The interval between each successive branch disturbance was consistent, the pace of something that was not alarmed, that was navigating toward a known point, that was not in a hurry, because hurrying was not what this required. I did not move. I did not call again. I stood on the trail with the headlamp pointed at the rhododendron margin and the cold air from the creek on the back of my neck. And I waited. The movement stopped. It stopped when I stopped calling. The silence afterward was complete, not the occupied silence of before, not the creek and the wind and the distant elk, but a specific, pressurized silence of the kind I associated with large animal proximity in heavy cover. The kind of silence that meant something was close enough to hear me breathing and had made a decision about whether to continue. 30 meters uphill, and behind me, James Aldrich said, "Hello? Is someone there?" He had sheltered under a rock overhang on the back side of the switchback, exactly where terrain analysis suggested the highest probability static shelter position would be. He had a twisted ankle from a loose rock on the descent and had been waiting for darkness to pass before attempting the trail. He was fine. His equipment was good. His decision to wait had been correct. I helped him back to the station. I did not tell him what I had heard in the trees. I logged the call-out accurately. Under the incident notes, where I normally wrote the resolution summary, I wrote, "Wildlife movement observed on northwest slope during name call interval. Unidentified species. Did not approach." Movement ceased when verbal calls ended. I wrote it in the flat language of all my field notes, the language that describes what happened without saying what it means. Then I closed the log, took out the binder, and read rule number 1 with entirely different eyes than I had read it with that morning. It took me about 20 minutes, back at the station, with the binder open and the wood stove ticking through its evening cool-down, to arrive at the frame I needed. The rules were not safety provisions. They were not policy. They were not administrative guidance written from a desk by someone who had studied the valley's operational parameters and arrived at rational precautionary conclusions. They were incident reports written in the imperative mood. Each rule described a scenario. Each scenario was specific, not in the generic way of policy language that covers a range of contingencies, but in the precise way of someone describing a thing that had happened to them. Rule number 1 did not say, "Be cautious with nocturnal vocalizations in the drainage." A policy writer would have said that. Rule number 1 said, "Don't call more than 3 times in 10 minutes." As if the person writing it knew exactly what happened at 4. Because they had gotten to 4. Because they had felt what I had just felt, standing on the spur trail at the 3rd call interval, watching the trees move. They had survived by doing the opposite of what their training said. And then they had encoded the survival into a document that looked like the training, so that the next person arriving at this station would read it in the same professional frame, with the same professional skepticism, and either accept it before their first payoff event or find the payoff event before they accepted it. I had found the payoff event. I reread rule number 2 with this frame. Someone had stood at the edge of a burning campsite at an unoccupied site and felt the pull of professional duty and survived by not crossing. Someone had stood exactly where professional instinct told them to cross and chose the 30 meters instead of what lay on the other side of them. I reread rule number 4 and felt the particular cold of a rule that described a cognitive failure rather than a behavioral one. The thing about counting was not irrational. It was the only honest description of how the reflex worked. It happened before you could stop it. And stopping it required you to catch it in progress, which meant you were already in the sequence before you could interrupt it. I reread rule number 6, and now the instruction to cover the footprints did not read as evidence suppression. It read as something else, something I didn't have a word for yet, which bothered me in the specific way that gaps in analysis bother me. Then I reread rule number 3. If the rules were written by survivors, written after the fact, written to describe what had nearly killed them, then the 5 previous versions from the sleeve pocket were testimony. 8 years of people writing down what they had experienced so the next person would have a sharper warning. The specificity increasing because each survivor had more information than the last. But this year's version was in future tense. It described a scenario that had not happened yet, which meant either this year's rule number 3 was not written by a survivor after the fact, or the person who wrote it already knew what was going to happen, already knew who was going to be here, already knew my category, my gender, the professional reflex that would make the radio call maximally effective against me. I needed to know when this year's card was placed in the binder. I needed the date. The laminated card for this year's rule number 3 was dated September 1st in the upper right corner, in the same compact, left-leaning hand as every previous version. I had an assignment confirmation email saved on my phone. No signal in the valley, but the email was cached locally, accessible offline. I had not thought about the date on the email since I received it, because dates on assignment confirmations are administrative details, and I had been focused on the logistics. I opened it at the table, under the station's single overhead light, with the binder open beside me, and all 6 rule number 3 cards spread in a row. The email was dated September 14th. District Coordinator Alan Bryce, GSMNP Operations. This confirms your seasonal assignment to Caldwell Fork Backcountry Station, effective October 4th. My name was in the subject line. My full name, Mara Voss, and below it, my permit number for the season, which I had been issued the same day. September 14th. My assignment confirmed. The laminated card in the binder. September 1st. 13 days before I existed as a data point in this station's administrative record. 13 days before any official document connected my name, my gender, my identity to this valley, something had written a rule describing me. Not approximately, not in the general language of covering all possible scenarios. The rule described a woman's voice asking for name and position confirmation on the radio. I was a woman. The radio scenario, it described the specific vulnerability of a SAR professional to a voice requesting identity confirmation on the operational channel. The reflex to confirm, the trained response to a colleague's request, was a precise description of my professional instinct. The thing the rule was protecting against was not a generic threat. It was a threat calibrated to the person the rule would belong to. A threat calibrated to me. I sat with this for a long time. I am a person who, when confronted with an impossible fact, does not react immediately. I work the perimeter of the impossibility first. I look for the rational explanation I may have missed, the administrative error, the simple alternative that makes the problem smaller. The simple alternative here. The binder entry was backdated. Someone dated the card September 1st when it was actually prepared later. Possible? It required someone at the district office to have done this deliberately, which required a motive I could not construct. Alternative 2. The date was coincidence, and the woman's voice language was generic enough to apply to any ranger. Except it was not generic. It was not if you receive an unverified radio communication. It was a woman's voice. It was a first name. It was calibrated. Alternative 3. someone who knew I was being assigned to this valley before the official confirmation was issued. Someone in the assignment pipeline, a supervisor, a colleague, had written the rule and dated it early, which meant the rule was not written by a survivor in the valley, but by an insider in the administrative process. This alternative was the most structurally coherent, and was also the one that made me want to call Alan Bryce from the ridge at the first available opportunity and ask who had written Section 3 of the binder and where the laminated cards had come from. I needed to talk to someone who had been in this station before, someone who had survived a season here and come out the other side and would talk about it. The assignment history was in the binder's front sleeve, long-term occupants, going back to 1987. Most were single-season assignments. One entry read, O. Hatch, 1987, extended. Ref, District Archive B-7. Below it, in different ink, someone had written a phone number in pencil. I had no signal. I had the ridge in the morning. I would wait. 3 nights after the overdue hiker incident, I was running the evening welfare loop on the northern drainage. Sites 40 and 41 were both unoccupied per the current permit log. The last registered camper at 40 had departed 2 days prior, and 41 had no registered occupant for the following 4 days. I had the permit sheet folded in my jacket pocket, which I checked at the junction before taking the northern spur, the same way I always checked it. Both sites, unoccupied. I smelled the smoke before I saw the light. Wood smoke in a drainage valley in October is not itself unusual. The occupied sites lower on the loop had fires, and smoke moves strangely in fog-heavy air, pooling in terrain depressions and traveling against the apparent wind direction. I filed the smell as carryover from Site 38 or 39 and continued up the spur. The light was visible from approximately 60 meters. Steady, warm, flickering in the regular rhythm of a well-maintained fire, not a flare-up, not a dying ember, but an active, tended fire at the approximate location of Site 40's fire ring. I stopped. I was at 60 meters because the terrain dictated it. A slight rise in the trail at that distance gave me a natural sightline over the campsite clearing before the trail descended into it. I had not planned to stop at 60. I stopped because the fire was burning and the site was unregistered, and the professional protocol for an unregistered campsite fire was to assess from cover before approach. That is the story I told myself. The truth is that rule number 2 had been sitting in the back of my professional mind since the morning I read it, and the sight of a fire at Site 40 specifically, which the rule did not name, but which was within the range it specified, activated a very specific awareness that I was standing in a described scenario. I moved forward carefully, slowly, and stopped at what my headlamp beam and rough terrain calculation told me was approximately 30 meters from the fire ring. The fire was steady and well built. The logs arranged correctly, the burn even, the color of good, seasoned hardwood combustion. Someone who knew what they were doing had built this fire. There was no tent. There was no pack. There were no personal effects visible in the firelight. No food bag, no hang line, no boots at the fire ring's edge. There was one boot, a child's boot, right foot. A dark, waterproof hiking boot, small kindergarten-age small, placed upright beside the fire ring, as if set there deliberately, as if removed by someone who had sat at the ring and needed to empty a stone from their shoe. The boot was dry. The boot was clean. There was no child. There was no second boot. There was no one. I stood at 30 meters, and I felt every professional instinct I had developed in 11 years of emergency response activate simultaneously and unanimously. A child. A child's boot. A child was somewhere in this drainage, in the dark, in 43-degree air, with fog coming in from the west, in terrain that made sound travel unreliably, and made any attempt at self-navigation after dark extremely dangerous. I was trained for this. This was exactly what I was trained for. And rule number 2 said 30 meters. I stood at 30 meters for 11 minutes. I counted them on my watch, minute by minute, because counting the minutes was the only cognitive task available to me that was not crossing the line. I stood at 30 meters with the child's boot in my headlamp beam, and the fire burning between us, and the professional calculus of a career built on action running in every register of my body. And I did not move. Rule number 2 was written by someone who had been in this position. Someone who had felt what I was feeling. Someone who had survived by staying at 30 meters when every fiber of their professional identity told them to cross. I logged the observation in my field notepad. Fire at Site 40, unregistered. Single child's boot visible. No occupants. Fire well maintained. I omitted the coordinates, exactly as the rule specified. I noted the weather, the time, the temperature. I did not write where it was. I turned and walked back to the station. I did not run. I did not look back after the first 50 meters, when the trees closed behind me and the firelight disappeared. I did not sleep. I went back at 0730 in full daylight with my field assessment kit and the specific grim energy of someone who has spent a night not sleeping and has replaced sleep with the preparation of questions. The fire was cold ash. The boot was gone. The site was clean in the way of a campsite between occupants, dead fire pit, loose soil around the ring, no litter, no sign of recent human habitation. The kind of clean that suggests no one was ever there. I crouched at the fire ring and looked at the ash. 8 years of working scenes in various stages of evidence preservation had given me a working knowledge of fire behavior that I had never expected to need in this context. The way a fire burns tells you something about how it started and what it consumed. The ash in the ring at Site 40 was consistent with a long burning hardwood fire, the color, the texture, the depth of the ash bed. But the log remnants at the ring's edge showed a burn pattern I had never seen outside of specific controlled burn research contexts. The logs had burned from the inside out. The exterior surfaces of the log remnants were charred, but intact. The outer bark was present, scorched, but not consumed. The interior was ash. The fire had originated inside the wood and burned outward, which was not how fire worked. Fire required an ignition point on the surface, a source of heat applied to combustible material from outside. A fire that originated in the interior of a log and burned toward the surface was not a natural fire. It was not any kind of fire I had a category for. There was no char on the soil beneath the logs. The fire had produced no downward heat transfer to the ground beneath it. No scorching on the earth of the fire ring. The fire had burned above the ground without touching it. I sat back on my heels and looked at the ash and the intact outer bark and the cold, unscorched soil. And I thought about the child's boot, dry and upright in the firelight. I thought about rule number 2 and its 30-meter exclusion, and the instruction not to log coordinates, and the fact that I had stood at 30 meters for 11 minutes while every professional instinct I had screamed at me to cross. I thought about what I might have found if I had crossed. The thought was not specific. I did not complete it. I was, professionally, not a person who completed thoughts of that kind without evidence to support them. I noted the burn pattern in my field notepad. Anomalous combustion, inside-out pattern, no ground transfer, external surfaces partially intact. And I left the site and walked back to the trail. On the ridge that morning, I called the number penciled in the front sleeve of the binder. It rang twice. A man answered on the second ring in the manner of someone who had been sitting near the phone. His voice was the voice of someone old enough to have learned that economy in speech was a courtesy to the person listening. "Hatch," he said. I introduced myself. I told him I was at the Caldwell Fork Station. I told him I had found his number in the assignment history, and that I had some questions about Section 3 of the protocol binder. I told him this in the calm, professional register of a colleague-to-colleague inquiry, because that was the register I had, and I was not yet ready to use a different one. There was a pause on the line. Not hesitation, something more deliberate than hesitation. The pause of someone deciding how much of a thing to give. "You've had your first payoff," he said, not a question. "Yes," I said. "Rule 1, he said, "at night. The trees moved." "Yes." Another pause. "Okay," he said. I asked him about rule number 3. I told him it was dated before my assignment was confirmed. I told him it described my profile specifically. I asked him if he knew who had written it. "I know who wrote every version of it," he said. "The person who was there the year before. The person who survived." The 2015 version is in the same handwriting as the 2023 version, I said. The same handwriting as this year's. "I know," he said. I waited. "The rule has been in that binder since before I arrived in 1987, he said. "My version described my situation that year. It described it correctly. What nearly killed me that year was the radio, not a woman's voice. Something different. Something fitted to what I was. And the rule I found when I arrived already described it. It was already there, written by someone who had already survived what I was going to face. The signal from the ridge was clear and clean, and I could hear him breathing. "Orrin," I said, "who writes the rule before the ranger arrives?" He said, "That's the question you're not supposed to spend too long on." I asked him about counting. Rule number 4, what it meant that counting completed something. The pause this time was longer. "The human mind counts automatically," he said. "You know this. You can't stop it before it starts. You can only catch it in progress. The valley uses this. Whatever is in that drainage, and I'm not going to name it. Because naming it is part of how it works. It uses the automatic functions, the reflexes you can't override because they happen before you decide. Counting is one of them. Calling a name is one of them. Confirming your identity on a radio call is one of them. He stopped. 7 is the threshold. You know this intuitively because 7 is the number the brain arrives at when it's been counting without supervision. Stop at 6. If you've already started, stop at 6. What happens at 7? I asked. You get marked, he said. It registers you. It knows you specifically, not just your category. Once it knows you specifically, the rules stop being enough. I wrote this down in my field notepad. I wrote it in the same flat observational language as everything else. Is it the Raven Mocker? I asked. I had been doing some reading in the station's small reference shelf, a worn paperback collection of Cherokee traditional narratives, which I had initially assumed was there for interpretive programming reference. He was quiet for a long enough time that I thought the call had dropped. I said, I won't name it, he said. What I'll tell you is that what's in that valley has been there longer than any name we have for it. And it adapts. It's been adapting for 40 years since I was there, and it adapted before that. The rules are the evidence of the adaptation. Every year, the rule for Rule 3 is more specific because it gets more information each time. You survive by obeying the rules exactly, and you give it a better picture of how to come at the next one. That's the bargain. He stopped again. Watch the counting. More than Rule 3, more than anything. The counting is where it catches people who think they're being careful. He said that was all he was going to say. He hung up without saying goodbye. I stood on the ridge in the October air and looked at the valley below me, at the fog in the lower meadow, and the elk grazing at the tree line, and the distant white point of the Palmer Chapel through the hardwood canopy. The valley was beautiful from above. It looked like the description in every GSM NP interpretive brochure I had ever read. I started down the ridge road, below the tree line, where the gravel met the valley floor, and the signal dropped away entirely. I heard the first elk call from the direction of the Beech Grove Cemetery. A high note, descending bellow. 1, 2, 3. And then I caught myself, mid-reflex, with the same sensation as catching yourself before stepping off a curb you did not see in time. The same lurch of the counter-decision arriving a half-second after the behavior it was trying to stop. I had already counted 3. I stood in the gravel road and held the number 3 in my mind and did not let it move forward. It took 4 full seconds. The elk called again. I pressed my lips together and counted something else instead, my heartbeats, which were elevated, which I noted without interpretation. The cemetery elk called once more and then was silent. I did not know if it was 6. I had stopped counting. Back at the station, I opened the wildlife reference binder. This is what field professionals do. When something doesn't match the documented baseline, you go to the baseline documentation and you measure the gap. You do not assume. You do not interpret. You measure. Bull elk rut vocalization. The binder's wildlife section cited interval data from the GSMNP elk monitoring program, which had been tracking the Cataloochee herd since the reintroduction in 2001. Vocalization sequence: 3 to 7 bugling calls in a sequence, followed by a pause of 4 to 8 seconds, followed by the chuckling bellow. This was consistent with documented elk behavior from multiple sources. The pause interval, 4 to 8 seconds, was the measured range across the monitoring program's years of recorded data. I had been listening to elk calls from my first night in the valley. I had registered the calls as normal. I had not been measuring the pause intervals because I had no reason to. I went back through my log entries. On 3 occasions, I had noted the elk rut activity by time and direction. I had not noted pause intervals because they had not been flagged as operationally relevant. I went outside in the late afternoon light and listened. The bulls were active in the meadow to the south, the herd's main group, visible at 400 meters. The calls coming in the correct sequence with the correct interval. 4 to 5 seconds between the end of the bugle and the start of the bellow. Normal. Documented. Exactly what the binder described. I listened for 45 minutes. Then once, from the north, from the direction of the Beech Grove Cemetery, at a bearing that placed the source approximately at the cemetery's uphill tree line, a single bull elk call came through. Bugling note, correct pitch, correct descent. I timed the pause before the bellow. 14 seconds. I timed it again on the second call. 14 seconds, not 4 to 8. 14. Consistent, both times, with a precision that itself was wrong. Natural animals showed variation, not locked interval repetition. I looked up the cemetery, bearing on the topo map. The Beech Grove Cemetery was accessible from the trail junction north of the station, a short, unmarked spur through dense rhododendron, ending at a saw, iron-fenced plot that predated the park. A dozen or so graves. I had passed the spur twice during welfare checks and had not deviated to enter. I noted the interval anomaly in my log without interpretation. Bull elk vocalization from Beech Grove Cemetery, bearing 17-14 hours. Bugle to bellow pause interval measured at 14 seconds. Documented normal range per GS MN P Wildlife Protocol, 4 to 8 seconds. Discrepancy, 6 seconds above upper bound. No other anomaly observed. Then, because rule number 5 required an entry, and I had already written the operational content, I added the temperature at the bottom of the entry, 41 degrees Fahrenheit. Dropping. The entry was the most carefully controlled piece of writing I had produced in 3 years. Every sentence accurate. Every sentence an observation. Not one sentence that said what the 14-second pause meant, because I did not yet have enough observations to justify interpretation. I closed the log. I listened to the cemetery direction for another few minutes. It was quiet now. I found the box on the 8th day. I was replacing a broken plywood slat on the underside of the cot frame, a maintenance task, purely functional. The kind of thing that falls to whoever occupies the station and finds it broken. I pulled the cot away from the wall, and there it was. A cardboard banker's box, pushed to the back of the frame's shadow, lidded, not labeled. The logbooks inside spanned 1987 to 2019. 32 years. Some years had thin volumes, a season with limited incident activity, brief daily entries. Some were thick with documented call-outs, search operations, trail closures, wildlife encounters. They were stored in order, oldest at the back, most recent at the front, in the manner of an archive someone had maintained deliberately over a long period of time. They should not have been there. The administrative instruction on the binder's cover sheet was explicit. Previous versions of Section 3 rules must not be retained on site. The logbooks were a different administrative category, but the spirit of the instruction was clear. Previous station records should be archived at the district office, not left in the field. Someone had kept them here instead. Someone had kept them here for a reason. I found Orrin Hatch's 1987 volume first because I was looking for it. His handwriting was different from the Rule Number 3 cards. Looser, larger, the hand of a younger man. Orrin Hatch in 1987 would have been in his early 30s. The entries ran from October 4th through the end of November, daily. The format of a careful and thorough field professional. Weather, temperature, patrol route, campsite occupancy, incident notes, radio check-in confirmations. October 4th through October 8th. Normal. Thorough, detailed, the entries of someone settling into an assignment and documenting it with care. On October 8th, the entry included a note about elk rut activity from the north bearing, and a measurement he had measured the pause interval. North bearing elk vocalization pause measured at 14 seconds, anomalous against documented norm. Will monitor. He had found it. He had measured it, the same number, 38 years before I measured it. October 9th. The entry cut off mid-sentence. Conducted perimeter check at 0600 per protocol. Frost on ground, light. No anomalous, that was all. October 10th, 11th, 12th, no entries. October 13th, an entry in handwriting that was Orrin Hatch's general style. The same letter formations, the same left lean, but subtly, measurably different. The pressure on the pen was lighter. The letter spacing was slightly more uniform, as if someone had practiced the hand rather than grown into it. The entry described normal patrol activity for October 13th. Weather, campsite checks, radio contact. Nothing anomalous, nothing that referenced the gap. The gap was unfilled, exactly as Rule Number 5 specified. Orrin Hatch was retired, alive, in Maggie Valley, 38 years after those October days. I had spoken to him on the phone. He had answered questions. He had warned me about counting. The handwriting after the gap was not his. I sat with this for a very long time. There were two possible architectures for what I was looking at. The first, Orrin Hatch had survived something between October 9th and 13th, had returned to the log, and his handwriting had changed under stress, a documented phenomenon. Physical trauma or extreme stress affecting fine motor control in ways that could persist and alter the hand. Possible, clinically documented. The second architecture I did not complete at the table. I let it sit at the edge of my thinking and looked at the rest of the logbooks instead. I checked every volume for gaps. Most had none. 3 had single night gaps that aligned by date with the elk rut's peak activity period in mid-October. 2 of those rangers' names appeared in subsequent assignment records. They had taken other posts in the park, filed normal reports, gone on to normal careers. The 2019 logbook had 2 gaps, October 14th through 15th, and then again October 22nd through 23rd. The entries on either side described normal activity. The ranger who had written them, a man named P. Delaney, per the front page, had never filed an end-of-season report. The assignment record showed his departure date as October 28th. No subsequent Park Service assignments, no forwarding information. I set the 2019 logbook down. I picked up the 2020 volume. Tucked between the 2 books, in the gap where someone had placed it deliberately, was a single index card. No lamination. Regular cardstock. Handwriting I did not recognize. It read, "Rule number 3 is not for you. It is from you." I set the card on the table and looked at it. 11 words. 4 of them repeated. The sentence did not require annotation. It was syntactically complete, semantically precise, and entirely clear in its meaning. The problem was not understanding what it said. The problem was deciding what it implied. I worked it the way I worked every analytical problem, starting from the outer boundary and moving inward. If rule number 3 is not for me, not addressed to me as its recipient, not constructed for my benefit or protection, then the conventional reading of the rules as a safety guide was not the only reading. The rules could be from someone and addressed to someone else simultaneously, the way a document can be authored by one person and received by another. I was the receiver. Who was the author? 3 interpretations, in the order I arrived at them. First, someone was impersonating my future self. Someone who knew enough about me, my name, my gender, my professional profile, my radio response patterns, to write a rule that would apply precisely to my situation, and who had done so in order to manipulate my behavior at a critical moment. This required a human actor with insider access and a motivation I could not construct. I did not dismiss it. I assigned it a low probability. Second, someone who knew me, a colleague, a supervisor, someone in the district administration pipeline, had written the rule as a genuine warning, had written it early, had backdated it, had placed it in the binder before I arrived, using intimate knowledge of my professional patterns to make the warning as specific as possible. This required a human actor with both insider access and knowledge of the Valley's mechanisms. Possible. Higher probability than the first interpretation. But it did not explain why every version for 8 years was in the same handwriting. Third, I would survive this season. I would come out the other side of whatever the Cataloochee drainage had been building toward for 8 weeks. And I would write the next version of rule number 3 myself, a future tense account of what had nearly happened to me, describing the scenario in precisely the specific terms that would protect the next ranger, the next person in this station, the next professional whose particular instincts made them useful to whatever was in the drainage. I would write it. It would go into the binder. It would be dated whenever I wrote it. It would be in my handwriting, which I had not yet compared against the cards in the binder's sleeve pocket. This was the interpretation that made the index card's sentence fully coherent. It is from you. Not from a predecessor, not from an impersonator. From me. From the version of me that survived and carried the knowledge out and encoded it for the next person. The card in the box was a message across the survival sequence, from a ranger who had already been through this to a ranger who was about to go through it, telling me that the rule I was relying on for protection was, in the final accounting, my own work. I stared at the index card for a long time. The third interpretation was the one I was most afraid of. I did not know why. Immediately, I sat with it and tried to name the specific quality of the fear, and eventually arrived at it. I was not afraid of surviving. I was afraid of what surviving required me to become. Afraid that the competence that made me good at this job was not the tool I would use to survive the valley. It was the thing the valley would use to make me useful to the cycle. I was afraid that there was no difference between the two. Outside, the elk began calling again. From the north, the cemetery bearing. I did not count. I did not count. And I was proud of this for approximately 2 seconds. And then I realized I had counted 2 calls before I decided not to. The radio activated at 22:47. Channel 7. The standard patrol channel. The channel I monitored continuously during active hours. The channel on which all routine GSM-NP patrol communication occurred. The channel that I had heard nothing on for the past 11 days, except scheduled check-ins from the ridge, and one brief traffic advisory from the district office. A click. The characteristic squelch break of an incoming transmission. Then a woman's voice, calm and professionally modulated, said, "Caldwell Fork, this is Park Ops. Please confirm name and position." I was at the table. I had been reading the 1987 logbook for the 4th time, comparing the pre-gap and post-gap handwriting with the precision of someone who was trying to measure a thing they did not want to confirm the measurement of. I heard the transmission, and I reached for the handset, and I stopped. I sat with my hand 1 inch from the handset, and I breathed. The voice sounded like Park Ops. It sounded like dispatch, the specific vocal quality of a trained radio communicator, controlled volume, clear diction, the slight, formal flatness of professional radio use. It sounded like a woman in her 30s with field experience. It sounded like someone I might know. I picked up the handset and keyed the channel. "Caldwell Fork," I said. "Permit 472 Bravo November 6. My permit number. Not my name. Not my position. Exactly what rule number 3 specified." The transmission stayed open. No response for 6 seconds, the same interval I had measured in the Elk Calls from the cemetery bearing. 6 seconds of open channel silence, which in radio protocol meant either a transmission fault or a deliberate pause. I could hear the channel's ambient static, which was clean and low. The static of a good signal rather than a degraded one. 6 seconds. Then the voice said, "Mara, can you confirm your position?" My first name. The voice knew my first name before I had confirmed it. I had given my permit number, a sequence of characters that, in the standard park operations system, would require a directory lookup to associate with a name. A legitimate dispatch call would have confirmed the permit number and used my last name at most, if they needed personal identification. A legitimate dispatch call would not have had my first name available on the fly in the middle of a routine check-in transmission. The voice knew my first name. The voice had been waiting to use it. Rule number 3. If the voice uses your first name, End the transmission immediately. I set the handset down in its cradle without keying the channel to close. The proper radio procedure was to key and say, Caldwell Fork, out. A clean close. I did not do this because doing it required me to key the channel, which required me to speak, which I was not willing to do. The radio stayed live for another 3 seconds after I set the handset down. The channel was still open on the other end. I could hear the static of an open transmission, clean, strong, professionally maintained. And beneath the static, for approximately 2 seconds before the transmission closed on its own, I heard something else. I will describe this accurately. I have not described it accurately to anyone before this account. It was not a voice. It was not words. It was a sound in the frequency range below speech. A low, resonant, exhalation-adjacent sound. The acoustic quality of a large, enclosed space processing the movement of air through it. I had heard one sound like it before, once, during a cave rescue operation in a limestone system in western North Carolina. The sound a cave passage makes when you enter it at the correct angle, when the pressure differential between the surface and the interior is exactly right. A sound like being recognized by something large and old, and unconcerned with whether you wanted to be recognized. The channel closed. The radio returned to its normal idle static. I did not initiate radio contact again. Rule number 3 was specific. Do not initiate contact until dawn. Dawn was at 06:47. I looked at my watch. 22:52. 7 hours and 55 minutes. I did not spend those 8 hours in passive terror. I want to be clear about this, because the honest account of this night is not the account of a person paralyzed by fear. It is the account of a professional doing the only productive thing available to her, working the problem. I took out every logbook from the box under the cot. I arranged them chronologically on the table and the floor and the footlocker. I opened my field notepad to a blank page, and I started building a timeline. Every gap in every logbook, date, duration, volume, year, ranger name, where legible, cross-referenced with the rule. Number 3 cards from the sleeve pocket. The 2015 version, describing the crying child near Site 39. The 2017 version, describing the self-activating radio. The 2019 version, describing the unoccupied campfire. The 2022 version, describing the figure at the meadow margin. The 2023 version, describing the voice of a colleague. Each version corresponded to a gap in the logbook from the same year. The 2019 card and the 2019 logbook's 2 gaps confirmed it precisely. The version describing the campfire was dated October 10th. The first gap in Delaney's 2019 log was October 14th through 15th, 4 days after the rule would have been written as a forward instruction. But Delaney had not survived the season. Or rather, Delaney had left the station, dated October 28th, and filed no subsequent report. I did not know what that meant. I was not ready to know what that meant. By 0100, I had the shape of the pattern, though I did not yet have a name for its mechanism. Something in the Cataloochee drainage activated in the autumn. The elk rut, the dying foliage, the fog from the Tennessee drainage, the specific acoustic and atmospheric conditions of late October in an enclosed valley. These were the context. Not the cause, the context. It had been adapting its approach for at least 40 years, and probably longer. The 1987 version of Rule Number 3, which I could not find because Orrin Hatch's card was not in the sleeve pocket, had been superseded and replaced. But Orrin had confirmed it described his situation precisely. Every rule was a record of an approach the thing had tried. Every surviving ranger had given it a clearer picture of what worked and what didn't. The rules themselves were the data archive of 40 years of refinement. The radio call at 2247 was the most sophisticated approach I had documented. Not a sound from the tree line, not a fire at an unoccupied site, not a figure at the meadow margin. A professionally formatted radio transmission on the correct operational channel, in a woman's voice, with my first name, using the precise vulnerability of my professional training, the trained reflex to confirm identity when asked to by a colleague. If I had confirmed, I would have given it my name in my own voice, my tonal signature, my specific acoustic identity, on record, submitted. Rule Number 3 existed to prevent me from giving it that. At 0300, I stopped writing and sat back and looked at the wall map with all the topo pins, the valley below ridge level, the creek drainage, the campsite grid, the cemetery bearing north of the station. 40 years of refinement, 40 years of approach and response and data accumulation and adjusted methodology. The thing in the drainage was not a predator in any model I had a frame for. It was something much more patient, something that understood the value of sample size. At 0417, the temperature gauge dropped 4 degrees in 11 minutes. The windows fogged from the outside, the first frost. I had the Rule Number 6 instructions memorized. I had memorized them on my second reading of Section 3 because memorizing the procedural content of rules was a professional habit. I went to get my jacket and my headlamp. The perimeter check for Eastern Aspect backcountry stations, per the binder's operational notes in the front section, ran counterclockwise. South face first, then east, north, west, and back to the door. The notation was specific about the direction. I had not understood why until now. Counterclockwise kept the station on your right as you walked, which kept you oriented toward the interior and reduced the distance from the wall at any point along the circuit to approximately 2 meters. I started at the south face at 0421. The frost was light, a thin skim of white over the compressed soil of the station's cleared perimeter, visible in the low beam of my headlamp as a faint sparkle on the ground that was not there in the mud and leaves beyond the edge of the cleared zone. The woodpile on the east side was frosted on top. The roof was white. South face, nothing. Clean soil, undisturbed frost. The boot prints of my own regular perimeter checks from previous mornings, clearly mine heel and toe spacing. Right boot's slight outward lean that came from an old ankle sprain, recognizable. East face, nothing. My boot prints in the cleared area from the generator shed visit 2 days prior. North face. The footprints were beside the woodpile, pressed into the frost-softened mud between the woodpile's east end and the station's north wall. Boot-shaped, full print heel to toe, 5 toes discernible in the toe box impression. The spacing suggested an adult, moving slowly, deliberately, parallel to the north wall in the direction of the wall itself. I stood at approximately 1 meter from the first print and did not move closer. Rule number 6. Do not measure them. The distance from my boot toe to the print's edge was approximately 8 inches. The print appeared to be approximately the same length as my own boot. I could not measure without measuring, and rule number 6 was specific. I straightened. Rule number 6. Do not photograph them. My field camera was in my jacket pocket, a standard compact unit I carried on every patrol. I did not take it out. Rule number 6. Do not follow them. The prints ran in a line parallel to the north wall. 6 prints visible before the trail ended. Ended at the wall. The north wall of the station, board and batten siding, painted park service green, sitting on its poured concrete footer. The prints walked up to the wall and stopped. Not turned, not angled away. Stopped. At the wall, as if the thing that made them had stepped through it. The prints did not come from anywhere I could trace. They began in the cleared zone, approximately 4 meters from the woodpile, with no continuation into the frost-covered ground beyond the cleared perimeter. No approach track. They started in the middle of the perimeter zone, walked to the wall, and ended. I looked at the 6 prints for a long time. The pre-dawn light was beginning at the eastern ridge, the sky lightening from black to the specific deep blue of late astronomical twilight. I could see the prints clearly without the headlamp now. Boot-shaped, approximately my size. 6 of them, going nowhere, coming from nowhere, ending at the wall of the station. The thing that had made those prints had been inside the station's cleared perimeter before first light. It had walked to the north wall. The prints were not coming out of the station. They were going toward it. Or it had come out of the station. And the perimeter check was not to find evidence of intrusion. It was to confirm the practice walk was over. I crouched and gathered loose dead leaves from the ground beyond the frost zone and covered the prints with careful, deliberate hands. I added loose soil from the unfrozen subsurface, patting it gently over the covered area, using the blade of my boot sole to distribute the covering evenly. I worked carefully, the way I worked every procedural task methodically, completely, without leaving any visible trace of what had been there. Then I stood up and went back inside. I sat at the table for a few minutes and did not pick up the pen. The logbook was open to today's date, October 20th. I had the temperature from the gauge, 37 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping. I had all the observational content of the past 8 hours organized in my field notepad. I had 8 weeks of anomalous data, cross-referenced, pattern-mapped, structurally coherent, in the way that a body of evidence is coherent when it has been gathered by a careful professional who knows how to build a picture from incremental data points. I picked up the pen. I wrote the entry. I wrote it completely, the radio transmission at 2247, the permit number response, the 6-second pause, the first name, the transmission end. I wrote the 8 hours of logbook cross-referencing and what the pattern analysis had produced. I wrote the frost morning perimeter check, the north face footprints, the boot shape, the approximate size, the absence of an approach track, the end point at the north wall. I wrote the covering procedure, executed in compliance with rule number 6. I wrote every detail accurately. I wrote every sentence as an observation, not an interpretation. I wrote with the professional specificity of someone who had been doing this for 11 years and knew how to make a record that a reader could use. Then I stopped and read what I had written. Every sentence was accurate. Every sentence was the product of a careful, thorough, professionally competent SAR coordinator, documenting an anomalous season in clear and useful terms. A new ranger arriving at this station and reading this log would have, in the entries I had made over the past 8 weeks, the most complete and specific record of the Caldwell Fork Drainage's October patterns that had ever been assembled. Better than the fragmentary notes in the older logbooks. Better than the rule number 3 cards from the sleeve pocket. Better than what any previous occupant had left behind. I had been here 8 weeks, and I had already produced a better map of the threat than anyone had managed in 40 years. Because I was good at my job. Because I was a solver. Because I was an EMT and a SAR coordinator, and a person whose professional identity was built on documentation and pattern recognition and accurate record keeping. And I had applied all of that to this valley with the same methodical competence I applied to everything. And I sat at the table and looked at what I had written, and I understood, slowly, in the specific way that a large and unwelcome realization arrives when you have been building toward it for a long time without knowing it, that I had not been documenting the threat. I had been feeding it. Every careful observation had given it more data. Every rule payoff I had experienced and survived and written down had contributed a more precise description to the record that the next ranger would read. The next ranger would read my log, and they would understand the drainage better than I had. They would be more prepared than I had been. They would be a more calibrated instrument, a more finely tuned subject, a more thorough data point for a thing that had been refining its methodology for 40 years. Surviving well was the mechanism. The competent survivors wrote the best rules. The best rules attracted the most capable rangers. The most capable rangers survived more precisely and documented more thoroughly, and the cycle refined itself with every iteration. I set down the pen. I looked at the binder on the table's edge, closed now, its laminated cover reflecting the overhead light. And I thought about the detail I had left out when I told this story before. The 2 seconds of audio between when I set down the handset and when the transmission closed. The sound I had described to myself as the acoustic signature of a cave recognizing your entry. I had not described it as a recognition before this moment. I had described it as an acoustic phenomenon with a geological analogy. But I knew, sitting at the table with the pen in my hand and the daylight coming into the frost-rimmed windows, what that sound had actually been. It had been the sound of something registering me, not as a threat, not as prey, as a contributor, as the season's most productive data source, as the author of the next rule. I told you at the beginning that there was a detail I always left out. Here it is. When I set the handset down at 22:52 on October 20th, the transmission on Channel 7 did not close immediately. The channel stayed open for approximately 2 seconds. I know it was approximately 2 seconds because I was watching the clock on the radio unit's face, a reflex I cannot fully explain, except as the kind of automatic precision that becomes habitual in people who spend years documenting event timelines. During those 2 seconds, the voice did not repeat my name. It did not say anything recognizable as speech. What it produced was below the register of language, a low, resonant, sustained sound in the subvocal frequency range, the kind of sound that you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. The kind of sound produced not by a larynx forming words, but by a large volume of air moving through a structured space with specific acoustic geometry. I had heard one sound like it before, exactly once, in 2021 during a cave rescue operation in a limestone system in Avery County. We were working a technical evacuation in a narrow passage system, going deeper. And at the point where the passage opened into a larger gallery, the air pressure differential between the exterior and the interior shifted, and the cave exhaled a long, resonant, sub-bass exhalation that moved through the passage like something becoming aware of your presence. The rescue team leader, a veteran cave rescue specialist named Gomez, had paused at that moment and said, without explanation, that we were in the right part of the cave now, that the cave had recognized us as belonging. I had thought this was a figure of speech. Standing at the radio table at 2252 in the Caldwell Fork station, listening to 2 seconds of sound before the transmission closed, I understood that Gomez had not been speaking figuratively. He had been using the only language available for a specific acoustic experience that does not have formal technical vocabulary. The language of recognition. The language of something large and structured, noting your presence, filing your signature, confirming that you were where you were supposed to be. The sound in the radio transmission was the same sound. Not metaphorically similar, not acoustically adjacent. The same sound on a Channel 7 transmission in the Cataloochee Valley drainage at 2252 on October 20th, where there was no cave system and no geological structure that could produce it. What I had heard was the sound of something registering my compliance. Not acceptance, not welcome, registration. The specific confirmation of receipt tone of a system that had been sent a piece of data it needed and had successfully logged it. I had given it my permit number when it asked for name and position. I had refused to give it my name. I had ended the transmission when it used my first name. I had followed rule number 3 exactly. And when I set the handset down, the thing on the other end of the channel had made the sound of a system completing an update. I had obeyed the rule. The rule had kept me from giving it my voice confirming my name. But obeying the rule, the specific, methodical, professionally competent act of following the protocol, exactly had told it something else. It had told it the quality of my compliance, the precision of my restraint, the specific professional profile of a person who would follow a rule exactly even when following it felt like abandoning a colleague. It knew me better than it had before the transmission. Not from what I had said, from what I had declined to say, and exactly how I had declined. I am still working out what that means. I have been working it out for 3 years. I have not explained, in this account, why I did not leave. I want to address this directly, because it is the question people arrive at when I tell them the partial version of this story. And it is the question that deserves a more honest answer than I have previously given. I did not leave because leaving was a decision with an architecture I had not yet fully mapped. I knew the rules worked. I had followed every one of them to its payoff event, and survived every payoff by compliance. I knew the season had a defined end, December 1st, 2 months from when the events I am describing occurred. I knew that if I left before the end of the season, the station would be vacant, and the next assignment would come in without the logbook entries I had accumulated, without the pattern analysis I had built, without the documentation that a subsequent occupant would need to survive at the level of competence the rules required. And I knew, this is the part I have to sit with, that my documentation was itself part of the problem. Leaving without writing was one option. It meant the next ranger arrived with the same starting knowledge I had arrived with. The 6 rules, the sleeve pocket cards, the box of logbooks from previous years. No better and no worse than what I had found. They would have to build their own picture. They would make their own mistakes in sequence. They might not survive their own mistakes, leaving after writing. Completing my documentation and departing with the full record in the logbook meant the next ranger arrived with my map, with my pattern analysis, with the most complete picture of the drainage's October mechanisms that had ever been assembled in that station. They would survive more easily. They would document more completely. They would provide a more refined data set, and the cycle would complete another iteration with greater efficiency than any previous iteration. I could not identify a version of professional competence that broke the cycle. Every good decision I was capable of making either endangered the next ranger or prepared them better for the thing they were preparing them for. The decision I had not yet made was the 4th line of Tull's note, the note in the logbook box, the 4-line note with the first 3 lines fixed, and the 4th line where each surviving ranger wrote what they decided. I had not yet decided what I decided. That was why I was still there. Not because I was trapped, not because the valley had taken something from me that I could not recover, but because the decision available to me had a moral topology I had not yet successfully mapped, and I was not a person who acted before the map was complete. I am not sure I have ever been more afraid of my own competence than I was in those weeks. I found the note on my 38th day in the valley. It was in the logbook box, as I had been told it would be, except I had not been told. Not exactly, because the index card from the 2019/2020 gap had not said where the note was, only that the rule was from me rather than for me. I found it because I went back through the box with the specific intention of finding anything I had missed in my first review. I found it tucked between the back cover of the 2023 logbook and the cardboard of the box itself, folded in half, written on standard field notepad paper. Daniel Tull's handwriting was recognizable from the station's maintenance log on the wall, where he had initialed supply inventory entries, the same small, compressed field hand. The note was 4 lines. The rules are real. Follow all of them, every time, exactly as written. I followed them. I survived. I am writing this from outside the valley. I found a note from the ranger before me in this same place, with these same first 2 lines, and a different 3rd line. He said he had found the same note with the same structure going back as far as the box went. I don't know if I'm still me. I read the 4th line 4 times. I don't know if I'm still me. I looked at the first logbook in the box, the 1987 volume, and I looked at the handwriting after Orrin Hatch's October gap, the slightly lighter pressure, the slightly more uniform spacing, the hand that was almost his and was not quite. I thought about Orrin Hatch on the phone, alive, retired, 71 years old in Maggie Valley. I thought about the way he had answered my question about who wrote rule number 3 before the ranger arrived. That's the question you're not supposed to spend too long on. I thought about the thing Orrin had told me about counting, about the automatic cognitive functions, about the reflexes that happen before you decide. I thought about the second most automatic cognitive function in a person's life, after counting, the continuous background process of being yourself. The ongoing, uninterrupted, unreflective experience of selfhood that runs beneath every deliberate thought, the way a base program runs beneath every application. The process you never examine because it has never given you a reason to. The process that, if it were interrupted and replaced with sufficient precision, you might never notice had been interrupted at all. Tull had survived. He had followed the rules. He had walked out of the valley and written his note and left it for the next person. He had included the 4th line as his single individual act of authorship within the fixed template. And what he had chosen to write in the 4th line was the one thing he could not verify from the outside. The note was the structure. The 4th line was the only place each ranger's individual selfhood survived in the record. And he had used his to say, I don't know. I am writing this at the table. The logbook is open in front of me. The pen is in my hand. It is the 1st of November, and the temperature outside is 31 degrees, and the valley has been under frost every morning for 10 days, and I have followed every rule, every time, exactly as written, for 29 days in the Cataloochee drainage. I do not know if the binder will contain a new rule number 3 next October. I do not know if the next ranger who arrives at this station will read my logbook entries and find them useful in the way I need them to be useful. I do not know if the note I will write, the 4-line note for the box, the note with 3 fixed lines, and a 4th line that belongs only to me, will say what I want it to say, or will say what I am capable of saying, or will say something that the thing in the drainage would find useful to have said. I know the rules work. I have the evidence of 40 years of logbooks and 8 surviving rule number 3 cards and 1 phone call with an old man in Maggie Valley who answered on the 2nd ring. I know that following the rules is survivable, and that the valley has a departure date on the calendar, and that December 1st is 29 days away. I know that the cave sound on the radio transmission was the sound of something that has been refining its methodology since before I was born, registering my compliance profile for future use. I know that the footprints in the frost ended at the north wall. I know that the fire at Site 40 burned from the inside out and left no char on the ground beneath it. I know that the elk calls from the Beech Grove Cemetery have a pause interval 6 seconds outside the documented range, and that I have not counted to 7. I know that Tull wrote, "I don't know if I'm still me," and that Tull is presumably fine in whatever life he went back to after October, and that this may or may not be evidence about the nature of the valley's mechanisms. The elk are calling outside, not from the cemetery bearing from the south meadow, the main herd, the normal direction, the documented pause intervals. I am not counting. I am not counting, and I am not thinking about whether what I hear is an elk or whether the thing that sounds like an elk has learned that the cemetery bearing has been logged in my field notepad and has shifted accordingly. I am thinking about the detail I left out when I told this story before. The cave sound, the registration. I have included it this time. I said at the beginning that I had decided to include it, and I have included it, and I am sitting with the question of whether including it changes anything about what comes next. I don't know if it does. I don't know who reads this account, or when, or in what context. I don't know if the person reading it is a ranger assigned to this drainage, or someone who found this document in a logbook box, or someone who was given this account by someone else in the long sequence of people who have tried to encode this knowledge into a form that might help the person behind them in the sequence. I know that I have 4 lines to write in the box. 3 of them are already decided. The 4th line is mine. I pick up the pen. I write the temperature. 37 degrees Fahrenheit, dropping